Sometimes the quickest joke reveals the slowest mind, and the quietest reply changes everything. A soft rain painted silver reflections across the sidewalks outside one of Chicago's most elegant jazz bars as warm amber lights spilled through tall windows onto the evening crowd. Inside, the room hummed with the gentle sound of a piano, quiet conversations, and the unmistakable rhythm of people trying to forget the weight of another long week. At a small table near the stage sat Olivia Brooks, a young woman whose graceful confidence drew little attention at first glance. Her mobility aid rested neatly beside her chair, while she calmly sipped sparkling water and listened to the music with an expression of peaceful contentment. She had arrived early to meet a close friend who had been delayed by traffic, and she seemed perfectly comfortable enjoying the evening alone. Around her, strangers occasionally looked in her direction before quickly looking away, uncertain whether to offer sympathy, curiosity, or nothing at all. Olivia had grown accustomed to those moments years ago. She no longer measured herself by passing glances. Across the room, Daniel Kong stepped through the entrance wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal jacket over an open-collar shirt, his composed expression revealing little after another exhausting day, filled with negotiations and responsibilities that rarely allowed room for ordinary moments. The bartender greeted him by name, while several regular customers quietly acknowledged his arrival with respectful nods. Daniel preferred quiet corners, strong coffee after long evenings, and conversations that required no introductions. As he scanned the room for an empty table, his eyes landed on the only remaining open seat, directly across from Olivia. He smiled politely as he approached, stopping beside the table with relaxed confidence. "Looks like every other seat is taken," he said lightly. Olivia looked up from the stage and returned the smile. Before either of them could say another word, someone sitting at the neighboring table laughed and joked loudly enough for several nearby guests to hear. "Careful, Daniel. Maybe that is your blind date tonight." The comment drew scattered laughter from a few people who believed the remark harmless. Daniel let out a brief, amused breath before looking back at Olivia with an apologetic smile. "Well," he said in a playful tone, "are you my blind date tonight?" The words hung in the air for only a second, yet somehow the room seemed to grow quieter. Olivia's eyes never left his. There was no anger in her expression, no embarrassment, and no trace of resentment. Instead, she smiled with remarkable warmth before answering in a voice gentle enough that everyone leaned in to hear. "No," she replied. "But maybe tonight you will finally learn how to see." The laughter disappeared instantly. Even the pianist hesitated for a single note before continuing the melody. Daniel remained standing beside the table, surprised not because he had been embarrassed, but because her answer carried neither accusation nor sarcasm. It sounded like an invitation rather than a victory. Around them, several guests lowered their eyes toward their drinks, suddenly uncomfortable with a joke that had seemed amusing only moments earlier. Olivia calmly gestured toward the empty chair across from her. "If you still need a place to sit," she said kindly, "you are welcome to join me." Daniel looked at the chair, then back at her steady smile. For the first time that evening, the noise of the crowded bar seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the quiet realization that this unexpected conversation was about to become something neither of them had planned. Daniel looked at the empty chair for another moment before quietly taking his seat across from Olivia. The soft glow of the hanging lights reflected across the polished wooden table, while the pianist eased into a slower melody that seemed to settle over the room like a deep breath. Neither of them spoke immediately. Instead, Olivia lifted her glass with an easy smile and said, "I hope you enjoy jazz. It has a way of reminding people to listen before they speak." Daniel smiled, this time without the confidence that had colored his earlier remark. "I think I needed that reminder tonight." Olivia laughed softly, not at him, but with the warmth of someone who understood that honest moments often begin with uncomfortable ones. The bartender approached and asked Daniel for his usual drink before turning to Olivia. "Would you like another sparkling water, Miss Brooks?" She thanked him by name, and he nodded with genuine appreciation before returning behind the counter. Daniel noticed the exchange immediately. "You come here often?" he asked. Olivia nodded. "Almost every Friday. The music is wonderful, and everyone treats me like a regular instead of a headline." Her answer lingered in Daniel's thoughts. He had spent years entering rooms where people recognized influence before personality. Sitting across from someone who valued ordinary kindness more than reputation felt unexpectedly refreshing. Rain continued tapping gently against the tall windows, while conversations resumed throughout the bar. The awkward attention from nearby tables slowly faded as guests returned to their own evenings, though a few curious glances still drifted toward them from time to time. Daniel decided to ask the question that had quietly settled into his mind. "When you answered me a few minutes ago, you did not sound offended. Most people probably would have been." Olivia rested her hands comfortably around her glass before answering. "Life gives everyone opportunities to become bitter. I discovered a long time ago that bitterness usually hurts the person carrying it more than anyone else." Daniel studied her expression. There was no performance behind her words, only quiet experience. Before he could respond, a young server carrying a tray of coffee cups accidentally stumbled when another customer pushed back a chair too quickly. Several cups tilted dangerously. Olivia reached out instinctively, steadying the edge of the tray before anything spilled onto the floor. The server looked startled before breaking into a grateful smile. "Thank you, Miss Brooks. I almost made quite a mess." Olivia smiled back. Everyone deserves a second chance before they need an apology. The young server laughed with visible relief and continued toward another table. Daniel watched the entire exchange without saying a word. It struck him that Olivia had never waited to be noticed before helping someone. Kindness seemed to arrive naturally, as though it had become part of her rhythm rather than a decision. A few minutes later, the pianist finished his set to warm applause. As he stepped away from the piano, he walked directly toward Olivia and greeted her with obvious affection. "I finally learned the song you recommended," he said proudly. "You were right. The audience always listens more closely during that one." Olivia congratulated him sincerely, and the musician thanked her before returning backstage. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. "You seem to know everyone here." Olivia looked around the room with a peaceful smile. "Not everyone," she replied. "Just enough people to remember that every place becomes brighter when someone chooses to belong instead of simply passing through." Daniel glanced across the bar as familiar faces nodded respectfully toward Olivia one after another. For the second time that evening, he realized he had entered the room believing he understood the person sitting across from him. Now he was beginning to wonder whether she understood life far better than he ever had. The evening settled into an easy rhythm as fresh melodies drifted from the piano and quiet conversations blended with the gentle sound of rain against the windows. Whatever awkwardness had existed between Daniel and Olivia at the beginning of the night had quietly disappeared, replaced by genuine curiosity. Daniel found himself asking questions he rarely asked anyone. He wanted to know what books Olivia enjoyed, why she loved jazz, and how she had developed the remarkable ability to answer uncomfortable moments with kindness instead of resentment. Olivia smiled as she stirred the ice in her sparkling water. "Life gives everyone difficult chapters," she said. "Some people spend years rereading them. I decided to keep writing new ones instead." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. He had built his reputation by staying guarded, always expecting hidden motives behind friendly conversations. Yet sitting across from Olivia felt strangely effortless. She never tried to impress him. She never asked about his wealth, his business, or his influence. Instead, she asked whether he had ever taken time away from work simply to enjoy an evening without checking his phone. Daniel looked at the device resting beside his coffee cup before quietly turning it face down. "Not often," he admitted. Olivia laughed gently. "Then tonight is already becoming productive." Before either of them could continue, an elderly gentleman entered the bar carrying a folded umbrella and carefully making his way toward the stage. The hostess greeted him warmly, but he appeared uncertain as he searched for an available table. Without hesitation, Olivia raised her hand with a welcoming smile. "Mr. Henderson, there is an empty seat over here until your friends arrive." The elderly man smiled with obvious gratitude. "You always notice everyone before anyone else does," he said warmly. Daniel watched as the gentleman sat nearby for a few minutes, exchanging light-hearted conversation with Olivia about music, books, and the changing seasons before another table became available. As he stood to leave, he turned toward Daniel. "You are in good company tonight," he said sincerely before walking away. Daniel remained thoughtful long after the man had left. It seemed every person who crossed Olivia's path carried a story of kindness connected to her. A few minutes later, the bartender walked over carrying a small dessert on a decorative plate. The chef insisted, he explained with a smile. He said Miss Brooks helped him prepare for a scholarship interview last year, and he has never forgotten it. Olivia looked almost embarrassed. He earned that opportunity himself, she replied softly. The bartender smiled. Maybe, but you believed he could before anyone else did. As he returned behind the counter, Daniel looked at Olivia with quiet admiration. You never mentioned any of this. Olivia shrugged gently. Good things become smaller when we spend too much time talking about them. Daniel smiled for what felt like the first genuine time that day. Around them, the atmosphere inside the bar had changed as well. Several guests who had overheard the earlier joke now looked toward Olivia with entirely different expressions. There was no pity in their eyes, only respect. The pianist returned for the final set of the evening and dedicated the opening song to the people who quietly make every room feel more welcoming. Olivia closed her eyes for a brief moment, allowing the music to fill the silence between conversations. Daniel realized he had entered the bar expecting nothing more than another ordinary night. Instead, he had found someone whose quiet strength challenged assumptions without ever raising her voice. And as the first notes echoed through the room, he began to understand that the most extraordinary people rarely introduce themselves. They simply leave every place kinder than they found it. The final piano set filled the room with a melody so gentle that conversations naturally became quieter, allowing every note to linger beneath the warm glow of hanging lights. Daniel found himself listening to the music with unusual attention, but even more than the performance, he found himself observing Olivia. She applauded every musician with genuine enthusiasm, smiled at every server who walked past the table, and somehow made every person who spoke with her feel as though they were the most important individual in the room. It was a gift Daniel had never learned, despite spending years surrounded by powerful people. As the applause faded, the pianist stepped down from the stage carrying a small microphone. Before our final song, he said with a grateful smile, there is someone here who has quietly changed the lives of many musicians in this city. Curious murmurs spread through the audience. The pianist continued, several years ago, when our community arts program was about to close because funding disappeared, one person stepped forward. She never asked for recognition. She only asked that children continue learning music. His eyes turned toward Olivia. Many of us standing on this stage tonight are here because of her generosity. The room grew completely silent. Olivia lowered her head slightly, clearly hoping the attention would pass quickly. Daniel looked at her with surprise, but before he could speak, the bar manager approached their table carrying an old framed photograph. I have wanted to show you this, he said warmly. Inside the frame was a picture taken several years earlier showing children gathered around worn musical instruments in a modest community center. Olivia stood quietly in the back of the photograph, helping a young girl hold a violin for the first time. There were no cameras focused on her, no formal ceremony, only genuine smiles shared among people who loved music. Those children still come here to perform every month, the manager explained. Some of them are now studying at conservatories because someone believed they deserved the opportunity. Olivia smiled softly. They earned every achievement themselves. The manager shook his head kindly. Maybe, but someone opened the first door. Around the room, guests who had overheard the conversation slowly turned toward Olivia with new expressions of admiration. Even those who had laughed earlier in the evening no longer seemed interested in explaining themselves. The truth required no argument. It simply existed. Daniel glanced around the bar before speaking quietly. You spend so much time helping other people succeed. Why have I never heard your name connected to any of these projects? Olivia looked toward the musicians preparing their final performance. Because if people remember my name instead of remembering the opportunities, then I probably talked too much. Her answer settled deeply in Daniel's thoughts. Moments later, a young violinist walked onto the stage carrying a beautifully polished instrument. Before beginning the closing performance, she looked directly at Olivia and smiled. This song is for the woman who taught me that limitations do not decide the size of a dream. Without another word, she began to play. The melody floated through the room with remarkable beauty, leaving many guests quietly wiping away unexpected tears. Daniel listened in complete silence, realizing that every meaningful introduction to Olivia had come from someone whose life she had quietly changed. She had never defended herself, never explained her accomplishments, and never asked anyone to notice her. Yet by simply living with compassion, she had transformed an ordinary evening into something no one inside the jazz bar would ever forget. The final notes of the violin performance lingered in the air long after the applause had faded. No one rushed to speak. No one seemed eager to interrupt the quiet reflection that had settled over the jazz bar. Daniel remained seated across from Olivia, his coffee untouched, his attention fixed not on the stage, but on the woman whose quiet presence had somehow transformed the atmosphere of the entire evening. For years he had measured strength by influence, confidence by reputation, and success by achievement. Tonight, every one of those definitions felt incomplete. Olivia simply smiled toward the young violinist as she stepped down from the stage, accepting a grateful hug before encouraging her to thank the music teachers who had guided her journey. "Talent grows because people keep believing," Olivia said softly. "Never forget the ones who stayed when progress was slow." The young musician nodded with shining eyes before returning to her family. Daniel watched the exchange with growing admiration. Nothing Olivia did seemed designed to draw attention toward herself. Every compliment she received became an opportunity to recognize someone else. A few moments later, the owner of the jazz bar approached their table carrying an old leather guest book. He carefully opened it to a page filled with handwritten messages from local artists and volunteers who had visited over the years. "I thought you might enjoy seeing this again," he said warmly. Olivia smiled as she recognized familiar names and heartfelt notes written by musicians who had once struggled to find places willing to give them a chance. Daniel noticed that many entries thanked her for encouragement rather than financial support. One message simply read, "You believed in me before I believed in myself." Another said, "Your kindness gave me the courage to audition." Daniel slowly closed the guest book after reading several pages. "You changed more lives than anyone realizes," he said quietly. Olivia shook her head with a gentle smile. "I only reminded people of what was already inside them." Before Daniel could respond, the bartender dimmed the lights slightly and announced that the evening would close with a community appreciation tradition held on the last Friday of every month. Instead of recognizing celebrity guests or generous donors, everyone in the room was invited to thank someone whose simple kindness had made their life better. One after another, people stood to share brief stories. A retired teacher thanked a young waitress for checking on her every week. A college student thanked the pianist for offering free lessons. A nurse thanked the night staff for creating a peaceful place after difficult shifts. Finally, without planning to speak, Daniel slowly rose from his chair. The room became unexpectedly quiet. He looked toward Olivia before addressing everyone with calm sincerity. "Tonight, I arrived believing I understood people after only a first impression. I was wrong. I met someone who answered thoughtlessness with grace, attention with humility, and curiosity with kindness. She reminded me that true strength is not measured by what we overcome alone, but by how many people stand taller because we chose to encourage them. I am grateful our paths crossed tonight." Silence filled the room before warm applause gradually surrounded them. Olivia lowered her eyes with quiet modesty, clearly more comfortable encouraging others than receiving recognition herself. As the applause faded, Daniel understood that the most important lesson of the evening had never been hidden inside a clever reply. It had been revealed through every quiet act of compassion that followed, proving that genuine character never needs to announce its presence because it quietly changes every room it enters. The applause slowly faded into a peaceful silence as the last guests settled back into their seats, yet something inside the jazz bar had undeniably changed. The room that had welcomed the evening with casual assumptions now carried a quiet sense of reflection. The bartender dimmed the lights another shade while candles flickered softly across polished wooden tables, giving the space the warm feeling of an old story reaching its turning point. Daniel remained standing for a brief moment, after speaking before returning to his chair across from Olivia. Neither of them rushed to fill the silence. Sometimes the most meaningful conversations began only after words had stopped. Olivia looked toward him with a gentle smile. "That was a very honest speech." Daniel let out a quiet laugh. It was probably the most honest thing I have said in a long time. Olivia nodded as though she understood exactly what he meant. Honesty becomes easier when we stop trying to protect our pride. Her words settled comfortably between them. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the city streets shining beneath rows of streetlights. Inside, the musicians carefully packed away their instruments while staff thanked customers for another memorable evening. Just as Daniel reached for his jacket, the bar owner approached with a small envelope in his hand. "Miss Brooks," he said warmly, "the Community Arts Board wanted you to have this tonight." Olivia accepted the envelope with quiet curiosity before opening it. Inside was a letter confirming that the neighborhood music mentorship program she had supported for years had officially received enough funding to expand into 2 additional community centers. Her eyes brightened with genuine happiness. "That is wonderful news," she whispered. "So many more children will finally have access to music." The owner smiled. Many people stepped forward after hearing the stories shared over the past several months. They said your example reminded them that generosity begins with ordinary people. Olivia carefully folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope without drawing attention to herself. Daniel watched her reaction with admiration. She celebrated the opportunity for others far more than any recognition she might receive. As the final customers slowly departed, Daniel walked beside Olivia toward the entrance. The hostess smiled warmly as she handed Olivia her coat. "See you next Friday?" she asked. Olivia smiled. "If the music is good." The hostess laughed. "It always is when you are here." They stepped outside together into the cool evening air where the rain had left the sidewalks sparkling beneath the city lights. Traffic moved quietly through the streets while distant jazz still drifted through the partially open doorway behind them. For a few moments they simply walked side by side without speaking. Daniel finally broke the comfortable silence. "Earlier tonight, I thought I was making a harmless joke. Looking back, I realized I was seeing only what was in front of me instead of the person sitting across from me." Olivia looked toward the reflections dancing across the pavement. "Most people learn to see with their eyes first," she replied gently. "The fortunate ones eventually learn to see with their hearts." Daniel smiled thoughtfully. "I hope I am becoming one of the fortunate ones." Olivia returned the smile as they reached the corner where their paths would separate for the evening. There was no dramatic farewell, no promise of what would happen next, only a quiet understanding that both of them would leave carrying something far more valuable than they had brought with them. Daniel watched Olivia continue confidently down the sidewalk before turning toward his own waiting car, realizing that the strongest people were not those who commanded the greatest respect when they entered a room, but those who inspired others to become kinder after they left it. The following Saturday morning arrived with clear blue skies stretching above the city, washing away the rain that had framed the unforgettable evening only days before. Daniel found himself thinking about Olivia's words far more often than he expected. Meetings felt shorter, conversations sounded different, and for the first time in years he noticed the people who quietly kept every place running without ever asking for recognition. Instead of beginning his morning inside a boardroom, he drove across the city toward the neighborhood community center, whose address the bar owner had quietly written on a small piece of paper before they had left that night. There were no reporters waiting outside, no assistants following behind him, and no announcements marking his arrival. He parked his car several blocks away and walked the remaining distance carrying nothing more than a pair of work gloves he had purchased. That morning, the community center stood on a quiet street surrounded by flowering trees and children's bicycles resting against a fence. Through the open doors came the sound of laughter, piano scales, and conversations filled with encouragement. Daniel stepped inside and paused, taking in the simple beauty of ordinary people working together. Volunteers sorted donated books across long tables, while teachers arranged classroom supplies and teenagers assembled music stands for an afternoon rehearsal. No one seemed concerned with titles or accomplishments. Everyone simply helped wherever they were needed. Olivia looked up from a table where she was organizing learning materials and smiled with pleasant surprise. "You found us." Daniel smiled back. "I hope I am not interrupting anything." She gently shook her head. "Around here, another pair of helping hands is always welcome." Without another word, she handed him a stack of books that needed to be carried into the library. Daniel accepted them without hesitation, spending the next several hours moving shelves, unpacking instruments, arranging chairs, and listening as volunteers shared stories about the children whose confidence had grown through music, reading, and patient encouragement. Not once did Olivia introduce him by his reputation. To everyone there, he was simply Daniel, another volunteer willing to spend his Saturday serving others. During lunch, a young boy practicing the violin approached Daniel with cautious curiosity. "Miss Brooks says every person has something valuable to give," he said. "What do you bring?" Daniel looked toward Olivia before answering. "I am still figuring that out." The boy smiled innocently. "Then you came to the right place. Everyone learns something here." Olivia quietly laughed while arranging fresh fruit onto serving trays for the children. As the afternoon continued, Daniel watched her greet every child by name, celebrate every small achievement, and encourage every volunteer with the same warmth she had shown inside the jazz bar. She never hurried anyone. She never spoke down to anyone. She simply created a space where people believed they mattered. Before leaving, Daniel helped store the last of the donated books inside the library. Sunlight poured through wide windows, illuminating shelves now filled with stories waiting to inspire new dreams. He looked around the room and realized that influence could build impressive buildings, but kindness was what truly filled them with life. As he prepared to leave, Olivia walked him to the front entrance. "Thank you for coming," she said sincerely. Daniel smiled with quiet gratitude. "No," he replied. "Thank you for showing me that changing the world rarely begins with extraordinary moments. It begins with ordinary people choosing to care." Olivia nodded gently as children laughed behind them and music drifted through the open hallway. Daniel walked back toward his car carrying no award, no recognition, and no applause. Yet for the first time in many years, he felt richer than when the day had begun because he had finally discovered a kind of strength that could never be measured by power alone. Several months passed, and what had begun as an unexpected conversation inside a quiet jazz bar slowly grew into something neither Daniel nor Olivia had ever tried to force. They did not schedule grand meetings or make promises about the future. Instead, they simply continued showing up in the same places where kindness had always mattered most. Every other Saturday, Daniel arrived at the community center carrying books, musical supplies, or simply a willingness to help wherever another pair of hands was needed. He repaired shelves alongside retired carpenters, unpacked donated instruments with high school volunteers, and patiently listened as children practiced songs that grew more confident with every passing week. No one introduced him by his reputation. To the students, he was simply Daniel, the volunteer who never missed rehearsal day. Olivia watched the quiet transformation with a grateful smile that never became possessive or proud. She understood better than anyone that meaningful change only lasted when it belonged to the person choosing it. One bright afternoon, the community center hosted an open house for families, teachers, and neighborhood supporters. Every classroom displayed artwork, every music room echoed with young performers practicing together, and every hallway carried the joyful sound of people celebrating one another's progress. Daniel arrived early to help arrange folding chairs before greeting parents as they entered through the front doors. A little girl proudly ran toward Olivia, holding a certificate she had earned after completing her first semester of music lessons. "Miss Brooks," she said excitedly, "I played the whole song without stopping." Olivia knelt beside her with genuine delight. "I knew you could. Now promise me you will teach someone else one day." The child nodded enthusiastically before running back to her family. Daniel observed the exchange quietly. He had come to realize that Olivia measured success differently from almost everyone he had ever known. She never celebrated what people accomplished for her. She celebrated what they became because someone believed in them. During the afternoon program, the center director invited several students to share what the community had meant to them. One teenage boy spoke about finding confidence after years of isolation. Another student explained that learning music had helped her discover a future she had never imagined possible. Finally, the director looked toward Daniel with a warm smile. "Would you mind saying a few words?" Daniel hesitated for only a moment before walking to the front of the room. Looking across the audience, he recognized many of the same volunteers who had welcomed him months earlier without asking who he was. "I used to believe leadership meant standing in front," he began calmly. "Now I believe it begins by standing beside people who need encouragement until they discover their own strength." He glanced toward Olivia before continuing. "The greatest teachers are often the ones who never ask to be noticed. They quietly help others believe in themselves, and then they step back so those people can shine. The room filled with warm applause, but Olivia simply smiled toward the students instead of accepting the attention for herself. As the afternoon came to an end, families lingered outside beneath the golden light of the setting sun while children laughed across the playground and volunteers folded tables together. Daniel and Olivia stood near the entrance watching the joyful scene unfold in comfortable silence. Neither of them spoke about the evening they had first met because neither of them needed to. That moment had already become something much greater than a clever reply or an unexpected conversation. It had become the beginning of countless quiet acts of kindness that continued changing lives long after the music in the jazz bar had faded away. 1 year later, the neighborhood community center stood brighter than ever before, its classrooms filled with music, laughter, books, and the quiet confidence of people who had learned to believe in themselves. Morning sunlight poured through wide windows, illuminating colorful artwork created by children whose dreams had once seemed far beyond reach. Families gathered outside beneath blooming trees, while volunteers welcomed visitors with warm smiles instead of formal introductions. No banners displayed the names of wealthy sponsors, and no grand speeches celebrated individual achievements. The day belonged entirely to the students whose lives had been transformed by compassion, patience, and opportunity. Olivia arrived carrying a small box of donated music books, greeting every child, teacher, and volunteer by name as though each meeting was the most important part of her day. Her familiar smile remained unchanged, calm, genuine, and filled with quiet encouragement. She paused to congratulate a young pianist preparing for his first public recital before helping another student arrange paintings for the afternoon exhibition. Around her, confidence had become contagious. The children who had once needed reassurance now offered it to newcomers with the same kindness they had received. Across the courtyard, Daniel stepped through the entrance wearing a simple navy sweater and dark jeans, carrying several boxes of newly donated instruments without drawing attention to himself. He no longer arrived surrounded by assistants or expectations. He greeted volunteers with handshakes, thanked custodians for preparing the building, and spent the morning assembling music stands beside high school students who knew him only as Daniel, another dependable volunteer. The center director quietly approached Olivia with exciting news. A neighboring city had approved funding for 2 additional community learning centers modeled after their program, giving hundreds more children access to music, reading, and mentorship. Olivia smiled with heartfelt gratitude before asking only one question. Will the teachers have everything they need? The director nodded proudly. They already do, because so many people decided to help after seeing what kindness can accomplish. During the afternoon celebration, children performed songs they had practiced for months, while families applauded with joyful tears. Paintings decorated every hallway, laughter echoed through every classroom, and every volunteer stood beside the students instead of in front of them. Before the closing performance, the center director invited everyone to recognize the countless people whose quiet generosity had made the community stronger. Instead of naming donors individually, she thanked every volunteer, every teacher, every parent, every musician, every librarian, every custodian, and every child who had chosen to encourage someone else along the way. The audience rose together in heartfelt applause that belonged to everyone equally. Daniel looked toward Olivia as the children began their final musical performance. "A year ago," he said softly, "I believed strength meant being the person everyone noticed." Olivia watched the young musicians with peaceful pride before answering. "Real strength is helping someone else become impossible to overlook." Daniel smiled, understanding those words more deeply than ever before. As the final melody filled the community center, sunlight reflected through the windows and across the faces of families whose futures had quietly changed. The children bowed proudly, volunteers embraced one another, and teachers celebrated every small victory that had led to this extraordinary day. When the music ended, there were no dramatic declarations and no promises about tomorrow, only grateful smiles shared between 2 people whose unexpected meeting had reminded an entire community that dignity grows wherever kindness is given freely. As evening settled over the neighborhood, lights continued glowing inside the center, while children carried books and instruments home with hopeful hearts, proving that one thoughtful conversation, one humble reply, and one decision to truly see another person could echo through countless lives long after the first words had been spoken. And on that peaceful evening, everyone present quietly remembered that the greatest vision has never belonged to the eyes alone, but to the heart that chooses to see the worth in every human being.